Yourself, please do that so we can start. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Shiur. Just a couple of, one major announcement that I do want to say. Next Tuesday night, the Shiur is going to begin half an hour early, 7:30. I want to accommodate one of the shul membership meetings, which is happening at 8:30, to which I'm going to join that. So I want to make sure that we have our Shiur. So we're just bumping it up to 7:30 to 8:30 as opposed from 8 to 9. So thank you very much, everybody, for your flexibility and accommodation. So tonight's Shiur is on Parshat Vayeshev. And I find these parashot, they're fascinating, but they're uncomfortable, at least for me. It's uncomfortable because as we read them, we're not reading them simply as a point of interest. It's not just an interesting story. It's a story of our family. This is where we come from. And the stories, especially these parashot, the story of Yaakov and Leah and Rachel and the children, it's a story of a family in crisis. It's a story of a family that's fractured. The sale of Yosef is just an example of just how fractured it actually is. And so in some ways, it's hard to watch and it's hard to read and it's hard to discuss because, as they say in Yiddish, this isn't fremde Menschen. This is not just strangers. This is us. This is our family. This is our yichus. And we're watching and listening and it touches your heart. At least it touches my heart and I'm sure yours. And I think that one of the reasons that it touches our heart is because it's not just the story. And it's not just the story that happened a long time ago. I don't know how many people who are sharing the Shiur tonight know a story about a family, maybe yours, maybe your relatives, maybe your neighbors, maybe you read, somebody you know, in which there's struggles in the family. And so when we read this story, although we may not have this specific circumstance that Yaakov Avinu and the brothers and Yosef had to go through, the idea of a family struggling with their relationships to the point that there are such strong emotions, not just under the surface, at the surface, well, that doesn't seem so far-fetched. This does not seem like an old text. In some ways, regrettably in some ways, this seems like a real text, a now text, a contemporary text. And maybe that's one of the reasons for me that it's a little unsettling to read about it, because it's not about the past. It's about families sometimes in crisis. And this is about the Jewish family in crisis. And in some ways, it leads to our first exploration of the evening. And in order to set the stage for our first exploration, I just want to go back to last week's Parsha of Vayishlach, a part that we did not talk about. But it's part of the Parsha, it's part of the story, and it's the very end of Parshat Vayishlach. And at the very end of Parshat Vayishlach, the Torah in the beginning of Perek Lamed Vav 36 spends an awful lot of time describing for us the generations and the blossoming family tree of Esav. Ve'ela toldot Esav hu Edom. And it tells us about Esav and how, in fact, his family grew and who begat whom, and the family is growing and growing. And not only that, it talks about how the family not just grew in physical numbers, but grew in power, and grew in status. It grew in people who occupy positions of rulership, people who are called aloof, like leaders. And the Torah tells us that these people ultimately became leaders of the area, certainly not necessarily leaders of the Jewish people, but listen to this verse. And now I'm reading in chapter 36, Pasuk Lamed Aleph, and this is all an introduction to Parshat Vayeshev. Ve'ela hamelachim asher malchu be'eretz Edom. Now these are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom. Lifnei melech livnei Israel. These kings reigned even before there was the very first king who reigned over Medinat Yisrael, then the land of Israel. And we go through it. I'm not going to go through it, but there are 8 kings. There were 8 kings listed here who reigned in the territory under the rulership of Esav, 8 kings, even before one king had ever ascended power in the land of Israel. And so then that moves us into Perek Lamed Zayin, the beginning of Parashat Vayeshev. Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz migurei aviv be'eretz Canaan. Yaakov settled in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan. Eile toldot Yaakov. Yosef ben Shvasrei shana haya ro'et echav batzon. V'hu na'ar et b'nei Bilha ve'et b'nei Zilpa neshei aviv. Vayavei Yosef edivatam ra'a el avihem. These are the chronicles of Yaakov. Yosef, at the age of 17 years, was a shepherd with his brothers by the flock. He was a youth with the sons of Bilha and the sons of Zilpa, his father's wives, and Yosef would bring evil reports about them to their father. So let's just look again at the beginning of verse 2, Pasuk Bet. Eile toldot Yaakov. These are the chronicles of Yaakov. So when the Torah introduces something as the Chronicles of Yaakov, you would expect that the Chronicles of Yaakov would be telling us similar to what the Chronicles of Esav did in the end of last week's Parsha. Because at the end of last week's Parsha, the Eile Toldot Esav, then the Torah began a very long chapter of 43 verses. 43 verses dedicated for us to learn about the Chronicles of Esav. And so now we're learning about the Chronicles of Yaakov, and I would expect a similar treatment. But the only thing we're reading about is one name, Yosef. One name. He has a whole family, doesn't he? So why one name? Why not a sort of parallel discussion similar to last week's Parsha? Rav Zalman Sorotskin was born in the mid-1800s, around 1865, I believe. He died 1966 in Israel. He was known as the Slutzker Rav. Amongst the things he wrote was a commentary to the Torah called Oznaim La Torah. He himself, as you can tell by the years of his life, was a Holocaust survivor. And he often makes reference to that in his commentary to the Torah. And in a, I think, important comment on this pasuk, I think that Rav Zalman Sorotskin attempts in some ways to frame better than I, understanding a little bit about the story that we're about to unwrap and read about, the story of our family, the story of the tensions, the story of the troubles. And he asks the question, why in this pasuk, which is introduced as the generations, the Chronicles of Yaakov, why does the Torah not tell us about the entire family? Why does it not just list everybody, that he had all these sons, or list them by names? Why does it only start with Yosef? And then he says, and why the juxtaposition, asks Rabbi Sorotskin, between the conclusion of Parashat Vayishlach, the 43 verses, which outline the entire genealogy and not just the birth story of Esav, but in fact their territorial positions, their status, their rulership. What's the reason between the juxtaposition of that and the beginning of Parashat Vayeshev? And so he offers an answer, which in some ways, of course, is unsettling, but that's what he's trying to say. This is an unsettling juxtaposition. This is an unsettling story. 8 kings. 8 kings were established by the family of Esav prior to the establishment of the first king in Israel. And why is that? And listen to what he says, because I think it's a significant statement. Eile shechayim be'ahava ve'achva beinehem. Those who live with love and brotherhood between them, ubocharim mikirbam melech o aluf, and choose from amongst themselves the king or the leader, asher al piv yetzu ve'al piv yavo'u, and according to whose decisions of the ruler people will lead their lives. They will go or they will come. They will enter into war or they will come back from war. And for therefore he says, come now and see. B'nei Esav, the children of Esav, the family, the descendants, they may not have all been the children of a single mother. However, says Rabbi Sorotsky, they never were fractured. They never splintered off into subgroups. They did not say, oh, we're the daughters of Bosmat, or we're the daughters of Oholiv, names of the women who Esav married. You did not have a story in the 43 verses that talk about Esav's family. There's no record of the family saying, we're the daughters of one mother, we're the sons of one mother, and we obviously get superiority. Not a mention, nothing. They lived together in peace and in brotherhood, and they chose from amongst themselves who was going to be the king over them. Not once, not twice, but 8 times. 8 times before one king could have been picked amongst the Jewish people. Why? Because we could not live like that. Because we could not free ourselves enough to have brotherhood and peace reign amongst us. How sad is that? That Parshat Vayeshev is juxtaposed to the end of Vayishlach, actually, for what purpose? To actually say, look what we have done to ourselves. They, the children of Esau, figured out how to live be'achva u'b'shalom with each other. And they had perhaps reason to argue, but they picked the king and they all submitted. They all submitted to the rulership of the king. Nobody argued. And the first king, then they picked the second king, and a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth, and a seventh, and an eighth. But us, we couldn't do it. And he says, how sad is that for the Jewish people, that we were unable to establish for ourselves the sort of unity that was described at the end of Parshat Vayishlach. And so, as I said in my opening comments, there's something about these stories that is unsettling. And I guess Rabbi Sorotsky also felt it. And he even finds some sort of textual basis for it, based on the idea of smichut parshiyot, that things are juxtaposed in the Torah for a reason. So not just, as I've said many times in our shiurim together, not just do we learn ideas from the words or from the psukim themselves, we often learn significant ideas from where the stories are actually placed and in the flow of the narrative, or in this case, the juxtaposition. The end of Parashat Vayishlach is intended, suggests Rabbi Sorotsky, to make us understand just how, I use a strong word, dysfunctional the family life of Yaakov's family seems to be described in the Sefer, in the Parashat Vayeshev. But we need to find, is it all so negative? Is there nothing redeeming about this story whatsoever? So I think that there is. So I want to go back and I want to read this pasuk that I read to you again, pasuk bet, chapter 37, Perek Lamed Zayin, pasuk bet. So I'll read it again. Eila toldot Yaakov, Yosef ben Shvasrei Shana haya ro'eh et echav batzon. Yosef was 17 years old. He was a shepherd with his brothers by the flock. V'hu na'ar, and he's a young boy. He's a youth with the sons of Bilhah, with the sons of Zilpah. Neshei Aviv, who were the wives of his father. Yaakov, of course, had Leah and Rachel, and also the Shvachot, who later became his properly constituted wives. And then the last part, listen to this. Vayaveh Yosef et dibatam ra'a el avihem. And Yosef would bring evil reports about them to their father. Now, in preparing tonight's shiur, I came across a perush, and I have not yet been able to identify the author of this, so I apologize. The author wrote a work called Afikei Yam. And in his work called Afikei Yam, the author points out you need to pay attention to the end of that verse. I'll read it again, at least in Hebrew and then in English. Yosef brought these evil reports to whom? El Avihem. What does Avihem mean? Their father. And the Afikeyam says, there's another way that this pasuk could have concluded, isn't there? It could have written that Yosef brought Dibatam Ra'ah, not El Avihem, but El Aviv, to his father. Now, both would be factually correct, of course, because Yaakov was his father and he's also the father of the other boys. But why did it choose to say Avihem and not Aviv? And the Afikeyam says there is a very clear reason why that is. And he suggests that the reason that the Torah tells us that Yosef brought it to their father and not to his father is because the Torah is trying to reveal to us something about Yosef's motivation. Had the Torah said he brought the Diba Ra'ah, the evil report, to his father, to Yosef's father, it would have seemed obvious that the reason for bringing the Diba Ra'ah was personal gain, was the sort of childish, immature, say, look, Abba, look what they're doing, yada, da, 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 immaturity, sort of trying to up his brothers. But that's not what it is. It says to bring it to Avihem. And the Afikeyam says, because if you see somebody doing something which you believe to be wrong, well, the Torah's already told us, not in this parak, but later on in Sefer Dvarim, that there is a notion of moral responsibility, of our sort of guarantorship one for the other. That if you see another Jew doing something wrong, we have a responsibility to somehow stop somebody from doing that, which would cause them harm, certain physical harm. You would pull a person off the street, off leaving the curb if you thought they were going to get involved in an accident. But would you also pull them back if you thought they were doing something that was going to harm their neshama? Yes, you would, except if you weren't sure that that person would be willing to listen to what you have to say. If you believe that your involvement, your rebuke, your tochacha would not be willingly accepted, then what should you do? Says the Afikeyam, you should go to that person's teacher or parent and tell them so they could use their specific relationship to perhaps help the person involved repair their ways. And that is why Yosef brought Dibatam Ra'ah El Avihem and not El Aviv, because his motivation was not personal gain. His motivation was not to somehow ingratiate himself into his father's heart and life. Had it been that, the word would have been Aviv. But since it says their father, says the Afikeyam, it's a little bit of a portal, a little bit of an opening to understand what might have been Yosef's own motivation. It wasn't sinister, it wasn't immature, it wasn't an opportunity for self-aggrandizement. In fact, it was born out of a sense of mutual responsibilities. Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh. He wanted to do something that may in fact help them. But there's even more to this than that. The Torah tells us, not in the pasuk I just read, and the pasuk I'm going to read for you now, the nature of the relationship between Yaakov and Yosef. And it's in the next pasuk. It's in pasuk Gimel. I'll read it. V'Yisrael ahav et Yosef mikol banav, ki ben zikunim kulo, v'asalo ketonet fasim. In English, now Israel loved Yaakov, obviously. Israel loved Yosef more than all his sons, since he was a child of his old age, and he made him a fine woolen tunic. The English, although is an accurate translation, does not reveal something that the Hebrew grammatic structure does reveal. So I want to go back to the Hebrew. The Hebrew of Israel loved Yosef, as written in the Torah, is V'Yisrael ahav et Yosef. Literally translated, it means, and Yaakov or Yisrael loved Yosef. There's nothing wrong with it. Well, there's nothing wrong with it, but there is a peculiarity about that. And the peculiarity is this, that in biblical Hebrew, when using the past tense, the Torah almost always, not always, but almost always, uses a device called Vav HaHipuk. So, for example, the very first word of this Parsha, and the name is derived from this word, is Vayeshev. Vayeshev Yaakov. What does Vayeshev Yaakov mean? Jacob settled. Jacob settled. it's a past tense verb because without the vav, Vayeshev is a future tense. With the inclusion of the vav in the verb, that's called vav hipuch, the vav whose purpose is to flip the tense of a future tense verb to past tense or a past tense verb to future tense. That is part of biblical Hebrew. And in order to understand the Torah clearly and precisely, we need to know that. So if the Torah employs and uses this device so regularly, it even starts the Parsha with the word, then let's go back to the pasuk I just mentioned. There is another way of saying, and Israel loved Yosef. The Torah says, V'Yisrael ahavet Yosef. But employing the vav hipuch device, which is so common, it should say, Vayehav Yisrael et Yosef. It would have been, and Yisrael loved Yosef. So why is the Torah not using the most common structure with the vav hipuch? It's a good question. So to answer that question, we need to know that according to a Rashi elsewhere in Sefer Breshit, in the fourth parak, the beginning of the fourth parak of Sefer Breshit, we're not going to go back to the Rashi. You're welcome to do so, but I'm just going to explain it orally without going back into the text. Rashi teaches us a little bit about the nature of biblical Hebrew grammar. And he says this, whenever the Torah uses the past tense as it's written here, the Yisrael ahav, and does not use the vav hipuch, which would have been Vayehav Yisrael, to simply translate it as a past tense verb is incorrect. What should it be? Vayehav Yisrael is Yisrael loved. But when it says V'Yisrael ahav et Yosef, it doesn't mean Yisrael loved Yosef. It means Yisrael had loved Yosef. Past perfect. Had already loved. The word already is not in the text, but that's what the implication of this tense is. So when the Torah uses the simple past tense that we know in regular Hebrew, Yisrael ahav et Yosef, its translation, it's accurate, grammatically accurate translation of this biblical Hebrew is not he loved, but he had loved. Now, why is that significant? It's significant because it therefore disconnects the source of Yaakov's love to what came immediately before it. Because when you say had loved, it takes that love back into the past. So meaning, to be very clear, what came right before this verb is Yosef bringing diba ra'ah, these evil reports to their father. And then it says, and Yisrael had loved Yosef more. Had it said Yisrael loved in the regular way, we might have concluded, do you know why he loved Yosef? Because he was such a better boy than the rest of them. Look, Yosef was bringing all these bad reports of what the kids were doing, and Yaakov didn't like them. He didn't approve, but he loved Yosef because Yosef didn't do any of those things. Had it said, Vayehav Yisrael, I might have concluded that the reason for Yaakov's love of Yosef is that Yosef seemed to be better. That's not what the Torah says. The Torah says that Yaakov's love for Yosef preceded all the things that Yosef had said to their father. So then wait a minute. You're probably thinking the following question. Well, if that's true, if that's what the correct meaning of the translation of the Yisrael Ahad is, then shouldn't that have come before the story of Yosef bringing the bad reports? That would have made more sense chronologically, wouldn't it? Yes, it would. Yaakov loved Yosef, and then the brothers did things that Yosef found problematic and tried to perhaps help them by going and talking to their father. That would have made perfect sense. The order would have been appropriate, and it would have made clear to all of us that Yaakov's love was not predicated on the fact that he thought Yosef was morally superior, a better behaved boy, none of that. So why not? And perhaps one of the reasons that the Torah chose to write it in this order, even though, as I said, the Yisrael Ahav et Yosef is past perfect, which means he had already loved Yosef before, was not to give us a glimpse of Yaakov's love for Yosef, but to give us a glimpse of the brothers' perception of all of this. The brothers' perception was that somehow the relationship between Yosef and Yaakov seemed to emerge or strengthen based on how Yosef was speaking about them. So in reality, the Torah is telling us that the relationship between father and son is not predicated on the dad's thinking the son is better, but it's an insight into how the brothers were feeling. The brothers were feeling, look at this kid. Look what he's doing. He's going to Abba, he's going to father, and he's somehow presenting himself as a tzaddik. And by the way, do we have another story in Chumash where a brother presented himself, or a son, I should say, as a tzaddik, and all of us with insight that's immeasurable knew that that's not true? Yes, Yitzchak, right? Yitzchak loved Esav. And what was Esav? Yeah, Esav was playing around with Yitzchak's emotions, according to so many of the Midrashim of the Chachamim. Yitzchak fell for the story, the persona that Esav tried to present as a tzaddik, asking shaylas and doing all these good things. And it's so possible that the brothers were thinking, oh my goodness, he's sort of perpetuating what that guy Esav, remember that our father's brother, what our uncle was doing, and how that whole story, I'm sure that they heard the story about the brothers and Esav, back and forth. Like, don't forget, Parshat Vayeshev began with Yaakov's dreadful fear of his encounter with Esav. So everybody's probably asking him, Abba, why are you so scared? So he went back and he probably told the story. So they knew about Esav. And now they're watching this little mini Esav unfold in their own family unit, Yosef behaving in a way that may have been reminiscent of their own perceptions of their uncle Esav. Again, you can just see how the family dynamic is playing itself out here. This is so complicated, it's so layered, and so many feelings are being brought to bear. But we have to read the story carefully, even looking at the choice of the verb usage. It's not Vayehav Yisrael, it's Vayisrael Ahav. And why would that be? So as I mentioned before, one of the reasons might be in order to make sure that we understand that from Yaakov's perspective, his love did not emerge from what he saw as Yosef's preferred behavior over his brother. But what was it? He was the son of his beloved wife, Rachel. He was born when Yaakov was older. And that's probably why he had this affinity to Yosef. It was different. It was different than he had of the other children. Okay. Let's go on a little bit more in the story. There's so much, of course, and my job, my job ends up being what to talk about and what not to talk about. So there's always going to be something next year, Baruch Hashem. So let's go further in the story. The story tells us, of course, that at some point, the brothers seem to be, they're doing their job, they're shepherds, and they've gone out of the area to graze and to take care of the cattle. And Yaakov calls Yosef over, and he gives him a job. What's the job? He says to him, Lech na re'eh et shlom achecha ve'et shlom hatzon v'hashiveni davar. He says, I want you to go, and I want you to check up on your brothers, check about the welfare, make sure everything's okay, check on the flock, and bring me back word. So, Vayishlacheu me'emek Chevron vayavo Shechema. And so Yaakov sent Yosef away from Emek Chevron, from the depth of Chevron, Emek from the word Amok, and he arrived at Shem. So here's the story, the next part. The next part is enigmatic. Like, what is this part? I want to read it. I'll read it in the Hebrew, then the English. Just listen to the story. Vayimtze'ehu ish v'hinei to'eh basadeh. Vayeshalehu ha'ish lemor ma tevagesh. And a man discovered him. And behold, he was blundering in the field. The man asked him, saying, what do you seek? Vayomer et achai anochi mevakesh. Hagidana li eifo heim ro'im. And he said, Yosef, my brothers do I seek. Tell me, please, where they are pasturing. Vayomer ha'ish nas'u mizeh ki shamati omrim nelech dotaina. Vayelech Yosef achar echav vayimtzaein b'dotan. And so Yosef went after his brothers and found them at Dotan. Now, one of the principles of rabbinic interpretation of the Torah, and I've said this in many different ways in different Parshiot, is nothing is extraneous, nothing is extra. One of the things that the Torah does not spend a lot of time on is description. So here I have 3 verses about an episode between the time Yaakov left his home, not Yaakov, Yosef left his home, fulfilling his father's request, and him meeting up with his brothers. Why do I need this? But it's here. So I have to wonder why. But not only do I have to wonder why, who's involved in this encounter? Well, I know Yosef is there, and there seems to be somebody else. And the person is consistently referred to by the same term 3 times. And the term is ha'ish, the man. So who is this man is a very interesting question. So let me suggest the following to you. And I'm going to continue with Rabbi Zalman Sorotskin because I think that this is a worthwhile explanation to just consider for a second. So according to what we're saying, he encountered a man. So rabbinic interpretation says it's not just a man. The Torah is using this as sort of like a key word here. And the answer is it wasn't a man, it was a malach, it was an angel. Not only was it an angel, the angel was identified as the angel of Gabriel. The angel was identified as Gabriel. Rabbi Sorotskin says the following. He says, how sad. How sad. How sad is it that an angel had to be sent from the heavens above on a divine heavenly mission to show Yosef the way in which he ought to go to meet up with his brothers and then have this whole sort of crucible, this test, this episode unfold the way it is. And that, of course, according to the way we're reading the story, everybody just fell apart here. Everybody, the brothers, look what they did. First they wanted to kill him, now they're not going to kill him. They sold him, and the whole story, the whole rupture, the whole fracture just takes such a serious and disturbing turn. And says Rav Sorotskin, Yesh le'itz te'er me'od al asher nishlach malach mimarom laharat Yosef et haderech. We have to be so distraught and upset that an angel has to be sent. And even, he says, even if there is some sort of divine plan that had been decided on by Hashem, that Yosef had to be sold as a slave to Mitzrayim. So even if that was the plan, and somehow is to lay the groundwork for Yaakov eventually to come down to Mitzrayim with a sense of dignity and not groveling, if that whole thing was still part of a divine plan, he says, what would have been missing in this plan, posits Rabbi Sorotskin, if instead of the angel finding him in the field, what if the Midianim found Yosef in the field? What if the whole episode could have bypassed the brothers? If it had to be that Yosef needed to get to Mitzrayim in order to have the whole story unfold, and so ultimately be there to prepare 7 years of famine. Okay, we know the story. And ultimately, Yaakov comes down and the children are there. If that whole story needed Yosef somehow making his way to Egypt, so couldn't Yosef have been, in Yiddish, verblunget, he's looking, he doesn't know where he's going. Okay, so that's where the caravan comes and they meet up, they overwhelm him, they grab him, they tie him. Look, we got a Jew, we're going to sell him, we're going to make some money. What would have been so terrible if that would have been the method by which Yosef ended up in Mitzrayim? Interesting question about why things have to happen the way they do. But his answer His answer again is a little bit disturbing because it's making us feel uncomfortable at how, according to Rabbi Sorotskin, the Torah does not want to do that. Why? Because had that happened, he says, and I'll read his words, because had it been that way, we might have sort of questioned God's fairness, God's judgment, and we might have been perhaps remiss in finding or not seeing the proper reaction to the story. He's worried that you and I reading the story may come to a conclusion that would have been incorrect. We might have said, boy, what's wrong with this Jewish people that God saw fit to bring them down to Israel? Like, that's such a mean-spirited God. He chose Abraham, he chose Yitzchak, he chose Yaakov, and now one of the beloved kids was kidnapped and taken. Like, what sort of God is that? And Rabbi Sorotskin is worried that that method of unfolding the narrative that had to unfold might have brought upon us a misunderstanding because of our limited perspective. And so therefore he says this, Lefichach, therefore, Heru lanu be'alil et hasin'a kina, that the Torah showed us in untarnished colors the hatred, the jealousy, shesarar bein b'nei Yaakov, amongst the sons of Yaakov, terem she'ardu Mitzrayim, even before they were brought down to Mitzrayim. Shegia ad laharigat olam, which could have led to almost the murder of their brother, or in this case, the sale of their brother. Hacholem odot melucha v'shulchan, who's dreaming about sovereignty, rulership. Ad she'akol yomru, until everybody reading the story would say clearly, because the story is just too bold to read any other way. Shelo hayu re'uyim az lichyot ke'am choshi, because they just weren't worthy then to live as a free nation, umalko bikirbo, freely choosing a king from its midst. And it was required, it was necessary, lishalcham el kur habarzel, to send this family, this people, to the fiery furnace of Mitzrayim, lihishtabed la'am echad, to la'am acher, to become enslaved to another nation, until shitrapu sham refuat nefesh, that they became healed for the illness of their soul. Wow, what a strong message. Again, Rabbi Sorotskin is saying that the family was so broken that in order to at least begin some sort of healing process that would take not a band-aid, but really a true healing process, there was no other way. There was no other way except through the slavery in Mitzrayim. And if Yosef were just sort of kidnapped along the way as he's lost in a field and sent to Egypt, we would miss this point. We would not understand. We would not appreciate and take a impartial, dispassionate, and maybe hard look at how this family was functioning and needed something dramatic to heal it. So he sees this idea of Vayinse'eu Ish as a necessary step, that God needed to send this heavenly messenger to direct it, to make sure that we did not sort of come to the wrong conclusion about how the Jewish people's future needed to unfold. But there's another explanation here that I wanted to share with you. I just need to find my safe here. From a collection of Midrashim. And this one focuses on an explanation of the Baal HaTurim. Now, we've had occasion in the past to study one of the ideas of the Baal HaTurim, and one of the methodologies that the Baal HaTurim uses is gematria, numerical equivalencies. That many of the Chachamim, the Baal HaTurim may be leading the list, believes that words are chosen not just because they are evocative of the messages we need to hear, but actually their numeric equivalencies also reveal a hidden meaning. So what's the numeric equivalency here? What is the Baal HaTurim saying? So Baal HaTurim here quotes what I mentioned to you before, that Rashi identifies this unidentified Ish, Aish, mentioned 3 times in this 3-verse episode of Yosef encountering the man as he's lost. So Rashi says this is not just the man, this is in fact the Malach Gavriel. And the Baal HaTurim says, interesting, that the gematria of Vayish Alehu Ha'ish, that the man asked him, is Begematria Malach Gavriel Sha'alo, that the angel Gavriel asked him. So here's a second. Let's stop. Let's say we're convinced it was Gavriel. Either Rashi tells us the idea of the gematria is yet another supporting parshanut device to explain who this person was. We do have 3 psukim, which seems to be unnecessary, but the inclusion, the understanding that this is not simply a happenstance encounter, there is a divine plan unfolding, that means something. But the divine plan unfolding depends on our understanding that the word Ha'ish refers to Gavriel. But not too long ago, like last week's Parsha, we also encountered the same word, Ha'ish. Does anybody remember the encounter? The night before Yaakov met Esav. Vayivater Yaakov levado vaye'avek ish imo. That he crossed over, and in that darkness of the night, he was there by himself, and he's wrestling vaye'avek ish imo. That a man, an identified man at the beginning of the story, wrestles with Yaakov. Okay, but here's an interesting thing. In this week's Parsha Vayeshev, it says Ish, and Rashi says, oh, that's Gavriel. In last week's Parsha, Yaakov is having a wrestling match with whom? An Ish, same word. You remember what Rashi said? We may not have had a chance to talk about this, but in case you're not recalling it, Rashi says that unidentified man was an angel, but not Gavriel. He was the angel of Esav. So how is it that the same word in last week's Parsha is the angel of Esav, and in this week's Parsha, the same word, Ish, is an angel, also an angel, but this one is the angel of Gavriel. So one of the great Hasidic masters, Rabbi Chaim Nitzanz, the sons of Rav, says, I know how you can decide whether the angel is the angel that best represents Esav or the angel of Gavriel, the angel that helps, the angel that's there to do a mission. Esav's angel was there to overcome and overwhelm and to cause struggle and maybe even destroy. But Gavriel, that wasn't his mission, it was the opposite. So the sons of Rabbi Chaim's son says, the way in which you can see is whether or not the Ish, that's the scribe, comes to do chesed or not. And if the tafkid, if the mission of the Ish is chesed, you've encountered Gavriel. But if you ask the angel for a bracha and he refuses, then he's not Gavriel. On the other hand, he is the angel of Esav. So you remember the story? Yaakov is wrestling, and he's holding him back, and he says, give me a bracha, tell me your name. The angel refuses. So here's an interesting story. The interesting story is told of one of the Hasidic Rebbes who was on his way needed to visit somewhere. He got to a town, he needed to go daven mincha, but he didn't know where the shul was, so he's running, he's looking, and he sees a young man, he sees somebody going, and he says, excuse me, can you help me? He says, I don't have time to help. Where are you going? I'm going to shul, I don't have time to talk. So the Rebbe figured if he's going to shul, that's where I'm going to go, I'm going to follow him. And of course he ended up in shul, just as the Rebbe, in fact, needed. He ended up in shul. Great. But he went over to the young man and basically said the following. He says, you know when a person is the Saro Shel Esav or the Malach Gavriel, based on what? Based on whether the person wants to offer you a chesed or not. I needed someone to show me where to go to shul. So if someone were to say, oh, welcome to our community, welcome to our shul, what can I do? Do you have a place for Shabbos? So that's the Gabriel. But if a person says, I don't have time, I'm sorry, I can't ask somebody else, there's going to be another bus coming, I can't ask. So that's the Saro Shalesa. So we have choices to make, I guess. We know what we want to be. Do we want to be that ish, that mensch, that's going to be the Gabriel mensch, or chas v'shalom, that mensch, which is on the other side? And let me just end with one story of a group of women who are sitting and talking about their experiences in life with their husbands. And they're all talking, and one lady says to the group, says, my husband, I can't tell you, he is an unbelievable guy. And she extols him and they praise him. And all of her friends are watching, listening, and they know the woman, and they know about all the troubles that she's had with her husband and how he's mistreated and insulted and was not respectful. And they say to her, like, we don't get it. We know you. We've been with you. We've seen what the issues are. You've told us what the issues are. So why are you calling him like this malach? You're describing him as a malach. And she looks at him and says, he's got to be a malach because he's for sure not a mensch. So we have a chance to choose which sort of malach we want to be. Do we want to be the malach Gabriel or chas v'shalom? Do we want to be the malach, which was best represented by Saro Shel Esav? Now, the story unfolds, and the brothers ultimately make the scheme, and they decide what they're going to do. The Torah tells us the following. As he comes close, and they grab him, they say to each other, they said to one another, look, the dreamer is coming, so now come, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we will say, a wild beast devoured him. That's what we're going to do. We'll kill him, we'll shacht him, and then we'll tell our father what happened. We'll make up the story. And then let's see what's going to become of his dreams. And Reuven heard. And Reuven rescued him, Yosef, from their hand. And he said, we will not strike him mortally. Lo nakenu nafish. We are not going to kill him. So there are 12 brothers. And it is Reuven who's the one who says, we're not going to kill him. But why? Why not? Why was it him? Why was it Reuven, of all the brothers, who said, don't kill him? And then a little bit later on, just a little bit further on in the Chumash, Reuven says, Vayomer lehem Reuven, al tishpechu dam. Don't shed any blood. Hashlichu oto el habor hazeh asher bamidbar. Let's throw him into this pit, which is in the wilderness. V'yad al tishlechuvo. But let us not lay a hand on him. Lema'an hatziloto miyadam. The Torah says, the Torah is now speaking as the narrator, this is no longer Reuven speaking. The Torah tells us that what was going on through his mind, in his mind, Reuven's mind, why him? Because he intended to rescue him from their hand and to return him to his father. Leman hatziloto miyadam lahashivo el aviv. Return him to his father. For Shlomo Kluger, who was one of the great Talmidei Chachamim in Galicia, huge, very prolific author, a brilliant thinker. And in his work called the Imre Shefer, Shlomo Kluger asks an interesting question. He says, if we assume that nothing is extraneous and nothing is unnecessary, so when the Torah told us what Reuven's plan was, which was Laman Hatzilo Tomi Adam, to save him from his hand, I think all of us are intelligent thinkers understood what the plan was, to save him and to bring him back home. So the end of the pasuk is really not quite necessary. La hashivo al aviv, to return him to his father, suggests Rabbi Kluger, is not an absolutely necessary part of the pursuit. It would have been okay to stop the pursuit and say, Laman Hatzilo told me Adam to save him. And you and I, as smart people, would have figured out the other part. So Rabbi Kluger, again, draws this family and sort of unlocks the door so we can peek inside. Sometimes when you peek inside, you wish you wouldn't, because you see things and you learn things that maybe you don't want to know. So I'm not sure about this one, but he said it, and it certainly psychologically makes sense. So in order to understand this explanation of Shlomo Kluger, we need to know something else that happens in the life of Reuven. See, Reuven was the firstborn son of Leah. That was his mom. That was his Ima. He loved her. And it no doubt was very difficult for Reuven to watch as Yaakov kept on continuously preferring the presence and the company of Rachel. And he saw it, and he knew that. And he probably also understood how his mother was feeling. After all, she named the babies, as we've seen in the previous parshas, with names that somehow revealed how she felt about being spurned by this man, and hoping that at one point Yaakov would love her the way he loved Rachel. Of course, it never happened. But it was hard for Reuven to watch this. And then, when Rachel died, and so that special relationship that existed between Yaakov and Rachel came to an untimely conclusion through Yaakov's death. Reuven, according to the Torah, did a very, very bold step. See, according to the Torah, and the way the Chachamim understood this part of the Torah, Reuven took his father's bed and put it in Leah's tent. He took it out of Rachel's tent and put it into Leah's tent. That's bold. I mean, that's really encroaching on your father's personal life in a way that no child should be allowed to do. No child should be allowed to do. There are things between a husband and a wife that are intimate that is just not the children's business. Not when they're young, and certainly not when you're old and understand the nature of husband and wife relationships. And yet, Reuven did it. So again, you're just seeing, oh my gosh, what it must be like in this family for this eldest firstborn to see his mother struggle and his feelings inside. But Yaakov got very upset with Reuven. Very, very upset for Reuven for doing this. Now, why am I telling you this part of the story? Because Rabbi Kluger says you need to know that story. Why? To understand this part of the Yosef story. Why was it Reuven who stepped up to save Yosef? Why him? There's all these other brothers. Why him? And Rabbi Kluger connects the two stories together and says it makes sense because Reuven was trying to find a way to reconcile with his father after the terrible thing that he had done, after the infringement on his father's very personal life by taking the bed and moving it and sort of involving himself where he shouldn't have. But how was he going to do that? He knew that he couldn't just sit down and say, forgive me, Dad, or he felt that that wasn't going to be sufficient. So he needed an advocate. Of all the brothers, he knew none of the other brothers could possibly have influenced the father into sort of being a little less unforgiving with Reuven, who was the only kid, the only child who had a chance of winning over Yaakov's ear and maybe whispering into his ear, but you need to ease up a little on Reuven. Who was it? Yosef. And Reuven, says Rabbi Kluger, had thought about this, that the reason that it was Reuven to step up to save Yosef was because Reuven was harboring this hope that if he were able to somehow rescue Yosef, Yosef would feel the sense of beholden to Reuven and could be convinced, hopefully, to go on Reuven's behalf and to ask Yaakov to perhaps forgive him for his trespass before. What an interesting explanation of the psychology that seems to be playing in the minds of these brothers, and how complicated it is. Families are complicated. People are complicated. And according to this Perush of Rabbi Kluger, the Imre Shefer, that's the name of his Perush, this was, I guess, in some ways pragmatic, utilitarian. I don't think it's fair of me to simply strip Reuven of any sense of humanity and compassion, but Rabbi Kluger does inject this notion of some sort of strategic decision-making in Reuven's thinking. So let's go on a little bit more. And I think maybe we'll conclude with this last comment. The story of Yosef concludes, and we know what happens. Of course, he gets taken down to Egypt. And then Perek Lamed Chet begins. And Perek Lamed Chet is clearly a divergence. It just changes the focus. It stops the Yosef story completely, which will, of course, pick up later in Sefer Bereshit, at least the next Perek. But in this Perek Lamed Chet, the story of Yosef recedes, and now it's the story of Yehuda. So just to be very clear, Yehuda had 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. And he had provided a wife to and died. And then the second son, Onan, married the wife of the first son, and he died. Now remember, there is a biblical concept of levirate marriage called yibum, which I don't want to make the focus of this part of the conversation, but it might explain why the same woman was given first to then Onan. Now there's a third son. And according to what seemed to be convention at that time, the woman, whose name was Tamar, should have been given as a wife to Onan. And she, Tamar, understood that, and therefore, as a young woman who still could have had a full life ahead of her, she did not seek another husband. She waited for her father-in-law, or for her future father-in-law, Yehuda, to give Shelah to her as a wife. But it never happened. And so Tamar did something extremely bold. And it's an amazing story. And again, that's not going to be the focus of my last comment. She went to where Yehuda was working as the shepherd, and she dressed up as a prostitute. She was camouflaged. She was incognito. And Yehuda comes and sees her and decides that he wants to have a little tryst with her. And she asks him for money. He didn't have his wallet, and she said, "Okay, I'll tell you what. Give me your stick and give me your ring and give me your cloak, and I'll take these things as surety, and you'll send me the money." Good. They have their encounter, and then Yehuda goes back. But a man of his word, he sends the money. But nobody can find this woman because she really wasn't a prostitute. She was Tamar. Time passes. In fact, 3 months pass, and then she becomes pregnant. And once Yehuda finds out that she's pregnant, he's furious because according to the law, according to the convention, she should have been unmarried and had no relationships with anybody else until she got married to Yehuda's third son, Shelah, which of course he seemed not to have any intention of doing. And so once it was discovered that she was pregnant, the appropriate penalty was the death penalty. And so Yehuda, in his constituted role as being, as it were, the shofet, the ruler, said she should be put to death, take her out and kill her. And she submitted to that. And before she is executed, she turns to Yehuda and says, "Listen, if you want to know who is the father of my child, the father is the person who owns all these things, the staff, the ring, the cloak." And Yehuda right away looked at them and realized they were his. And realizes that what had happened, in fact, was a travesty. He had not done what he should have done. And Tamar pushed him into recognizing that. And he says about her in the presence of other people, "Tzadka mimeni," she's right and I'm wrong. I'm wrong. Okay. So this is the story. About this story, the Midrash makes a very interesting series of comments. This is, I'm going to read you the Midrash. Shvatim hayu asukim b'chirato shel Yosef. The immediate antecedent of the story is how all the family, all the brothers were busy with the sale of Yosef. The Yosef haya asuk b'sako u'b'ta'anito. Yosef, of course, was overwhelmed and overcome by his own travail, and he, as it were, was wearing sackcloth and bemoaning the fate that was unfolding around him. So the brothers are selling Yosef. Yosef is dealing with the unfortunate future that he seems to see, the darkness. Reuven haya asuk b'sako u'b'ta'anito. Reuven is now dealing with his own misfortune because he missed the chance to actually save Yosef, and perhaps, according to the Imre Shefer, even strengthen his relationship with his father. So everybody seems to be now upset. The brothers are upset because of the role they played. And Yosef's upset because what's happening to him. And Reuven's upset because of his lost opportunity. The Yaakov haya asuk b'sako u'b'ta'anito. And Yaakov now is inconsolable and is grieving over what he believed to be the death of his beloved son, Yosef. Everybody is upset. The Yehuda haya asuk likach lo isha. And what is Yehuda doing? He's looking to find a woman for himself. The Hakadosh Baruch Hu haya usek borei oro shel melech haMashiach. And what was Hashem doing? Hashem was busying himself, creating the first lights of the Mashiach. Why? And this again is not the main point, because the pregnancy of Tamar ended up with the birth of twins, and these twins ended up being the progenitors, the ancestors of David HaMelech, and from David HaMelech comes the Mashiach. So it's an interesting midrash which sort of tells us everybody is doing their own thing, and it looks like Yehuda is more involved in his own self-satisfaction, but Hashem, of course, seeing the whole picture, understands the broader context of all human life, and Hashem already saw the seeds of redemption in the story here. So a typical Hasidic interpretation of the story. Rav Simcha Bunim of Pshischa, one of the great earlier Hasidic masters, suggests that we don't just spend the time looking at how terrible everybody's life was, Yaakov and Reuven and Yosef, or even at the last part of how the world was sort of beginning to cultivate, God was cultivating this Mashiach. Rav Simcha Bunim says, maybe we ought to focus on the part that less people are focusing on, which is what? Yehuda. Like, what's he doing? Like, he's looking for having a good time. Is that really what we should be doing? So Rav Simcha Bunim of Pshischa offers a really different take on how you should read that part of the Midrash, at least the part that describes that Yehuda haya asuk likach lo isha. Because Yehuda is the only one in this Midrash that's what? Getting on with his life. Interesting idea. Getting on with his life. So while everybody else in this Midrash is described in some way, and I know this is a little bit of an over-exaggeration, but there's an element of truth to it. The Midrash is describing everybody as sort of stuck in either grief, or stuck in either guilt, or stuck in anguish, except for God, of course, but all the human beings in the story, whether it's Yaakov, whether it's Yosef, whether it's Reuven, they're all stuck. They're all sort of unable to pull themselves out of their sadness. What does Yehuda do? He starts something new. He starts a new part of his life, a beginning, a new business venture. He's looking how to do this. He's starting to look for a wife. He's beginning to think about a new beginning, a new tomorrow. And in fact, of course, Yehuda's recovery from the past lays the groundwork for what? Mashiach. So whereas maybe when we read the Midrash the first time, we might have wanted to criticize him, it's through Yehuda that the seeds of the Mashiach ultimately are sown, metaphorically as well as biologically. That's a different take. With Simcha Bunim of Pshischa is asking us to open up our eyes a little bit and consider that maybe the geula, maybe redemption, maybe the hope for the future comes about through, I guess, a type of resilience and a type of an insistence to pick yourself up from the sadness, from the ashes, from the turmoil, from the unexpected turn of events that happen in our lives, and to start building new. And together with Yehuda's strength and Hashem's, I guess, mysterious involvement in planning, there is the promise of a geula. It's a hard message in some ways, but in some, I find this to be personally relevant and resonates because, as I've often spoken about, both Rochelle and I are children of Holocaust survivors. And I know that some of you listening tonight and joining in the Shiur either are yourselves Holocaust survivors or have members of your family. And in some ways, that's exactly what happened. I can speak to my own mother and father who went through the unspeakable horrors of the Shoah. And they were like Meyer. They were like what the River says was Yosef and Yaakov and Reuven. But in some ways, my mother and father, as my in-laws and many of others, chose to be more like the Yehudas in this Midrash, starting anew. Not that they forgot, and not that there wasn't elements of sadness, no doubt, but they pulled themselves up and they created a future from which I'm born. So I don't think I'm any harbinger of Geula, but I think that it's a description of how sometimes that Yehuda-like quality is necessary, and it's that Yehuda-like quality that ultimately leads us forward and can bring us to the hope and the confidence that we need that there will, in fact, be a Geula. May it happen, b'mehera b'yameinu. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And for those who weren't here when I started, a reminder, next week's Shiur is going to happen, take place at 7:30. So I'm so glad that you're here. If you want to unmute yourselves and share some thoughts, I'm happy to have a bit of a conversation with everybody. Thank you for joining again.
Thank you, Rabbi. Beautiful message.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Beautiful.
Excellent, excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Indeed. Thank you. I'm glad that you're all. Thank you. Thank you.
Be well.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Thank you so much.
You got a question from New York here.
Oh, welcome. All right, good. Thank you.
We give everybody.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
We give everybody a name. We call Moshe Rabbeinu. Avinu. When it comes to Yosef, we call him Yosef HaTzadik.
Yosef was the tzaddik. That's right.
And I've always been Yosef HaTzadik. And when you talk about the brother, they were a big tzaddik, they say.
Correct.
That's always and evolve the character in Chumash to pick them out as tzaddik. That's how I did. Well, I found it jarring.
So, I mean, Yosef was called a tzaddik because the one event that really the one event that I think caused the Chachamim to highlight his secret, his righteousness, was the interaction with Potiphar's wife and his ability to overcome the enormous Yetzer Hara. Chachamim say that, in fact, he was totally planning to have sex with her completely, and was at the last minute, saw his father's image, and he ran away and he stopped. And that sort of ability to overcome that urge was what caused, gave them the feeling that he was a tzaddik completely. They, on the other hand, are not exactly. I'm sorry, the phone is ringing. I'm just trying to, okay. They, I think, were never, they are tzaddikim, but they never merited being called tzaddikim. They were shiftei kah. They were the shabbatim, the tribes. And yes, they behaved in a manner, they made some serious mistakes for which the Jewish people have been paying for many, many years. So it's an interesting point that you're raising, Marty. Like, should they have been given that sort of status of being elevated? I guess when you believe that history is by the divine plan.
One question. Simcha,
Hi, Simcha.
one quick, what the Ketonet Pasim has to do with the story?
Yeah.
With what?
The Ketonet Pasim, the coat with the colors, what is the symbol? What can we say very quickly?
So the Ketonet Pasim was an expression of Yaakov's love for his son. And in some ways, I think it was seen by the brothers as being like a mantle, a mantle of leadership. And that was one of the other things that I think made them feel even more angry, because if anybody should be wearing the mantle of leadership, it should have been the oldest. It should have been Reuben.
Yes.
But he forfeited that, and it went to Yosef. So I think that this mantle, that this Ketonet Pasim that he made for Yosef was a sign of leadership and love, because after all, he had the dreams. But I don't think that it played out the way the Yaakov was intending it. I don't think he was intending to explicitly tell the brothers that he will be your ruler. Although when the Torah says that after the dreams, Yaakov shamar et hadavar. Yaakov never forgot the dream, because Yaakov himself was a man of dreams. Yaakov knew that dreams are not just some dreams. He dreamed. He saw the angels, Yordim va'olim. He knew what a dream was. He knew that dreams are prophetic images, but he understood how potentially explosive these could be to his family. And then, of course, he was 100% right. Did he know what happened to his son? That's a really other good question.
That's right.
That's a good question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simcha. And thank you to everybody for joining me tonight. I just want you to know how much I enjoy your joining and listening and participating and questioning. It means a lot to me. So I want to give you a bracha of having a healthy week, a Mazel Dika week, a Chesed-ful week, a Mitzvah week, and Yitzhak Hashem, we'll see each other maybe before, maybe we'll see you in Shul. And if not in Shul, Yitzhak Hashem, we'll see you next Tuesday night at 7:30. Okay, everybody? Be well. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Be well. Bye-bye.